the Russians are going at the moment. They're trying to get closer to these cities and nodes of transport and infrastructure so they can use artillery. That seems to be what they're doing. I think the summer offensive on a broad front has sort of petered out. You're seeing, I think, quite a lot of sort of drives into Ukrainian territory, but they are sporadic. They don't seem to be linked up at all. You're certainly not seeing mass armies being deployed and things like that.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're talking about the war in Ukraine with Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry, who spent 36 years in the Royal Navy commanding HMS Gloucester and HMS Fearless. Chris has also been on operational and combat tours in Northern Ireland, the Gulf and the Falklands. He's now a strategic forecaster, commentator, historian and author. Chris, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello.
President Trump has announced that the US has repositioned 2 nuclear submarines in response to threats from the former Russian president, Dmitry Medvedev. How do you assess that move?
This is just a war of words, really. Whether you move a ballistic missile submarine one way or the other is irrelevant, to tell you the truth. When you've got missiles that can fire thousands of miles, moving them closer or further away, I'm afraid, doesn't mean anything. We all know that Dmitry Medvedev is the sort of incontinent sort of blowhard that the Russians use whenever they think they're in trouble. And I suspect this has been a threat that's been sort of cooked up in advance of President Trump taking any action with regard to secondary sanctions or indeed supplying Ukraine with more advanced weapons when President Trump's self-imposed sort of deadline runs out.
And previously, the West and especially the US had been more cautious in some of their nuclear language when they were, in getting into these sort of war of words. Is it the right time to kind of meet Russia's nuclear threat in a way like this on the world stage?
I think the Russians for some time have been sort of waving the nuclear saber around. It seemed, throughout the whole of the first year of the war in Ukraine, every time the free world sought to either support or indeed supply Ukraine with any sort of weapon, the nuclear saber came out. The trouble is that nobody believes you. You're not going to open a nuclear war with essentially fairly serious nuclear powers just for the sake of some sort of kilometers in Ukraine. It just doesn't work like that. We have to bear in mind that quite a lot of nuclear weapons, particularly at the top end, are regime threatening and indeed city killing weapons. These are not just high explosive rounds. And to sort of talk of them like that, I'm afraid, is irresponsible. What makes it a bit more serious in Russia's case is that they, along with China, India, Pakistan, Israel, all say that nuclear weapons are warfighting weapons. They're not deterrent weapons. So you have to listen to what they say and try and interpret what is really being said. And as I said, I think if you bring the nuclear debate up so early in a conflict, they can't be serious. It's just an idle threat by a bully who's got them and thinks it's going to impress anybody at all. The fact of life is that they know very well the United States, United Kingdom, France has weapons of equal destructive power that can definitely do harm to Russia. Given its size, the only weapons that can do harm to Russia really in terms of regime threatening sort of moves are nuclear weapons. So it's almost self-defeating in some ways in bringing it out. They know there aren't going to be any consequences for them doing it. It impresses their own people, of course, that they're doing it and speaks to a different audience. But frankly, in military terms, it's next to nothing in terms of advantage.
And how does the Russian and US underwater capability stack up? Are the Russians going to be trying to track these submarines if they do think they're being moved closer than they were previously?
The United States and Russia are always tracking each other's ballistic missile submarines. It's been going on for some time now. Russian units are always looking for British ballistic missile submarines, as they are French and United States. During the Cold War, we used to keep track on as many of their ballistic missile submarines as we could. And I suspect we're on the case again with all sorts of technologies that we didn't have during the Cold War. If you can actually locate your opponent's ballistic missile submarines, it gives you a huge advantage. It actually threatens deterrence, of course, if one side thinks that its primary deterrence weapon is being detected. It's a constant battle. But It's difficult. I mean, nuclear submarines are designed to be quiet nowadays. The latest Russian submarine, the Bory class, is not too bad in terms of noise quietening and acoustic hygiene. Not as good as American or British or indeed French, but they're pretty quiet. So you're going to have to use quite a lot of technology to find them. But they're not bad. I mean, the Russians have got 16 ballistic missile submarines, of which probably at any time 9 are operational. They include 8 of these Bory class, the latest, which have the Bulava intercontinental ballistic missile, and it's equivalent to Trident used by the Americans and the British. And it's all part of the game that is being played, pieces on the chessboard. But frankly, this idea that they're being moved closer to Russia is irrelevant when you've got basically intercontinental ballistic missiles that go into the exo-atmosphere and re-enter at a time and place of choice with multiple re-entry vehicles. It's irrelevant. It's pure rhetoric. And people who don't know about these things, I'm afraid, have got in their tiz about it.
Well, elsewhere, more activity that will probably be being watched by the West is this joint naval exercise that's going on between China and Russia. How closely should we be watching military cooperation between these two nations?
Oh, we need to be watching the cooperation that goes on between China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea very closely indeed. We've seen progressively that Russia and China are doing military exercises at scale together. It's been going on for about 10 to 15 years now. And we've also seen indications that if one of them is involved in conflict with another country, and it's probably the United States that's in the frame, they're going to be helped by the other. We've seen it in the Pacific. We've seen it slightly in the Atlantic, but mostly in the Pacific. And we've seen joint deployments in other places as well. So more and more they're cooperating. And we have to accept that there is a semi-formal alliance between what I call the Eurasian autocrats, Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. They're supplying each other with weapons. They're helping each other's supply chains in relation to military platforms and systems. We can expect them to cooperate in future to a greater or lesser extent. I mean, for example, in Ukraine right now, I mean, the Russians are making extensive use of Iranian Shahed drones. Most of the components that go into Russian missiles and other military systems come from China. And we know that North Korean troops have been on the ground, particularly up in Kursk Oblast, facing onto the Ukrainians in Sumy. So, yeah, I mean, we need to be worried because if Russia makes threats, if it gets itself too far in somewhere in a military conflict or indeed confrontation with the free world, you can expect China to be backing it up. First of all, in terms of logistics and support, but more importantly, in terms of weapon systems. But you know, we need to be pretty clear about this. China supplies weapons, you know, high grade military weapons to the Houthis, for example, and to Iran. I mean, who would have thought 20 years ago that essentially an insurgent group in Yemen would deploy ballistic and cruise missiles that are the envy probably of most nation states. So this is a new world, and this sort of semi-formal alliance that goes on between these authoritarian regimes, we have to see as a whole. You're not just confronting one of these, you're confronting all of them if you actually have to deal with them.
And these drills that are going on at the moment between Russia and China are going on in the Sea of Japan. It's notable that China has not provided as much military support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But does that go both ways? Does it mean that Russia wouldn't get involved if China were to make a move on Taiwan, for example, or even just get more aggressive in the Pacific? Does it go both ways? Would Russia step in if they have the capability naval-wise?
I think it's almost certain the Russians would assist the Chinese, not in direct operations against Taiwan or any other target, but they would certainly, I think, take up space and take up the marking capability of the free world, and particularly the United States. They provide intelligence. They get in the way, basically, and you wouldn't know what they were going to do. I mean, I suspect that if we deployed forces, the free world, deployed forces to deal with that, either in terms of deterrence or confrontation, you'd find Russian naval forces getting in the way. You'd certainly find their submarines in attendance, trying to stay close to American carriers. I mean, significantly underwater, the Russians are a lot better than the Chinese. I mean, most Chinese submarines you can hear from a long way away. It sounds like a box of spanners underwater, um, and so Russian submarines will bring a distinct advantage in terms of surveillance and marking of free world forces in that respect. So yeah, I would expect to see quite significant cooperation below the level of engagement by the Russians in support of the Chinese in those circumstances.
And we talk about where Russia gets its support from on the world stage. We've heard more out of the White House in recent days. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller saying it's not acceptable for India to buy Russian oil. That's as part of this ongoing pressure the US is putting on India over its purchasing of Russian energy resources. Is this the right approach to take, and why put this pressure on India, but seemingly not the same level of pressure on China, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think China's got quite a lot of sources of supply. For example, 48% of its energy needs come from Iran. So it's not quite as dependent as India is. Now, we have to be quite clear. India is getting its energy from Russia at a considerable knockdown price. It's not only using it for its own industry, it's also reselling it and making a profit on it. So, understandably, the Americans aren't very happy with that. Um, India has got to make a choice. At the moment, it's trying to sit on the fence. Does it run with the Eurasian autocrats, or does it come towards the maritime democracies? Well, its grand strategy suggests, with its rivalry with China, that it instinctively should come to the maritime democracies. But the fact of life is, in sitting on the fence, it serves the purposes of Russia and China, and to a lesser extent in Iran as well. Pretty well. And so I think what the Americans are saying is, look, you're making a killing out of this in terms of all this sort of cut price oil, particularly you're getting. That's got to come to an end because there are no penalties for Russia if they can continue to export to you like that. So with the prospect of these so-called secondary sanctions coming on, India has to be put in the crosshairs of any regime in the United States that wants to actually deal with that.
And we've also heard that the de facto Russia envoy Steve Witkoff will head to Russia in the coming days. Is there any sign that you can see that Russia wants a ceasefire ahead of Trump's recent deadline?
I don't think so. I think the Russians will do what they normally do. They try and brazen it out. They'll think, even at this late stage, they'll think that Trump is huffing and puffing. But they should take note of what happened during President Trump's last ultimatum to Iran. He said, within a certain time, I'm going to take some action. And the next thing you knew, there were B-2 bombers bombing the Iranian nuclear sites. I don't think we're going to get direct military action. But one of the big advantages that America has with President Trump is he's perceived to be unpredictable. And the last thing the Russians want is unpredictability. They need to be able to tell their own people a narrative. They need to keep projecting onto the world stage. They also need not to drag their partners in. China will not want to be dragged into an argument with the United States, given the market pressures that China is under right now. So China will be saying to Russia, play it long, and Russia will be trying to do that. I suspect that President Trump will impose secondary sanctions. He doesn't like being thwarted. He made a great play of bringing Vladimir Putin to the negotiating table. And if he doesn't get results, if he doesn't get a deal, he's going to be very disappointed. And in the past, that disappointment has led to decisive action. So I think the Russians probably need to sit up and take notice unless they're going to really brazen this out. I mean, their economy is shaky, there's no question. And if President Trump manages through his secondary sanctions to lower the oil price significantly, there's no way that Russia can continue the war the way they are at the moment and indeed continue their military build-up. I mean, the concern from the American side, I think, is that in response, Russia will lash out, not at the United States, but at somebody else, which is important to the United States. Or indeed, they'll step up these grey zone hybrid activities against America's allies, particularly in Europe.
Well, Yes, and on that, the think tank IISS has released a report on their monitoring of Russian-linked hybrid attacks in Europe, showing they've increased more than threefold. Do you think we in the West, and especially in Europe, are prepared for increased espionage and attacks from Russia?
Oh, in no way. And this is despite warnings now for about 15 years. And it seems that in our democracies, we never really take action until it becomes manifest that there is a threat. At the moment, it's a notional threat in most people's minds. But I mean, it even extends beyond that. For example, if drones are launched against the United Kingdom, they will hit their target. We have nothing to stop them. Similarly, if cruise missiles and ballistic missiles are launched against the United Kingdom, we can't stop them. And there's been no attempt, I'm afraid, to deal with this issue. If I were an investor right now, if I were a smart person listening to Times Radio, I would be investing in concrete and diggers now, because underground facilities are going to be very important. We've seen in Ukraine, we've seen in Gaza and elsewhere, you need underground facilities to help you cope with this, not only to shield your vital infrastructure, but also to keep your key defense sites clear. I mean, having aircraft out in the open now is a thing of the past. Even the Russians now, even with the strategic depth they've got, are saying, look, we need to put hardened shelters in all of our air bases because they've been so vulnerable. We've had this incident of Bryce Norton recently. I mean, Bryce Norton is wide open to all sorts of drone attacks. Somebody with a drone they've made in a garden shed could attack Bryce Norton right now or anywhere else. That's not to encourage people to do it, but I'm just saying there's the problem. And we've got to get smart about these things. We've been living in this sort of la-la land of false security, and the world is coming at us at an increasingly accelerating rate and saying, look, it's not good enough.
Well, speaking of drone attacks, in Russia itself, there's been a Ukrainian drone attack which has set fire to an oil depot in Sochi. How do you judge Ukraine's ongoing campaign of drone attacks and long-range strikes on Russian oil infrastructure?
Well, the Ukrainians are looking to try and increase their production to about 200 a day, but this is in the face of a Russian capability that looks like it's increasing to a capability of about 1,000 a day. We've seen some massive attacks by drones recently, particularly last month, where on 3 days we saw attacks of up to 700 drones. And that's quite significant for a country. Ukraine's a big country, it's got lots of infrastructure, but that's going to have an impact over time. Russia, huge country, of course, and the range of drones can only be extended by that very innovative way that the Ukrainians did it, by taking them on the back of trucks in containers. So the way I think it'll happen is that those drones that can actually reach Russian infrastructure, you're going to see an increasing focus, I believe, on the infrastructure that exists within Russian-occupied Ukraine, particularly Crimea and Sevastopol. The problem is the Ukrainians, of course, is they're hurting their own fellow countrymen under Russian domination. So they're obviously reluctant to do that. But I suspect that in the short term, the Ukrainians will go for short-range targets and try and increase the mass that they can actually put across to swamp Russian defenses and also hit key targets. I think we shouldn't underestimate the way in which the Russians have come to terms with drone attacks. They're using a high level of electronic warfare and jamming to stop drones getting through. And indeed, on the Ukrainian side, you're seeing a lot of success, both in terms of missile, gun, and anti-drone technologies being put in place. And one of the interesting things is to see how this will play out, because drones are the flavor of the month at the moment. Anti-drone technology is advancing pretty quickly, and it'll be interesting to see how quickly the solutions come in. And let's just say in 2 years' time, we go, what was that about? Drones will be part of the landscape, but so will counters, I suspect, within a very short while. Ukrainians will do what they can. They'll attack targets of opportunity, I suspect. It won't be as systemic as they would want because they don't have the numbers of drones that are able to penetrate. I suspect they will be looking for longer range missiles from the United States as part of any ramp up of capability. I saw an article in a Ukrainian journal last week saying that the thing they really need is Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States. And it'll be very interesting to see if the Americans are prepared to supply those, because they've got advanced technology. You wouldn't want one captured intact, for example. But they strike over distance. There's no question about that, and it would escalate the supply ratio quite significantly.
And on the ground, the Russian summer offensive continues. Russia claims it's taken the settlement of Chasiv Yar. I mean, photos show that the city's now almost entirely rubble, largely reclaimed by overgrowth. Should we be concerned, though, with what Russia could do with that settlement? Is there the chance of a breakout, a drive towards northern Donbass or cities like Konstantinivka?
Yeah, the strategy seems to be with the Russians is, if you can't use drones and missiles, what you can use is your artillery. And quite a lot of the Russian campaign at the moment seems to be to gain territory so that you can be within range of being able to shell Ukrainian cities, which is a very cost-effective way of doing it. And of course, the Russians, we know, are very good at mass artillery and things like that. So that seems to be where the Russians are going at the moment. They're trying to get closer to these cities and nodes of transport and infrastructure so they can use artillery. That seems to be what they're doing. I think the summer offensive on a broad front has sort of petered out. You're seeing, I think, quite a lot of sort of drives into Ukrainian territory, but they are sporadic. They don't seem to be linked up at all. You're certainly not seeing mass armies being deployed and things like that. What is interesting, though, is you're not seeing many tanks spearheading these attacks. And that's what drones have done. They've cleared the battlefield of tanks and armored vehicles, and you're seeing quite a lot of infantry up front. And that's quite interesting. Where I've seen a difference is that the Russians seem to be using a large number of small, specialized special forces teams to do sabotage and also deep infiltration. Now, that suggests to me that they are preparing for these artillery battles, because they'll need spotters, they'll need all sorts of communications people, they'll need sabotage. And these Spetsnaz type activities are increasing along the front at the moment. So instead of going for mass, they're doing essentially what the Germans did in World War One. They're using highly mobile, highly effective small teams that create quite a big impact.
So would you judge a level of significant strategic success in that Russian summer offensive, or is it still that sort of grinding forward that the Russians have been employing for pretty much a couple of years now?
Yeah, it's very desultory. We're in sort of First World War sort of trench systems at the moment in many ways, and you're seeing basically penetrations here and there. You're seeing the Ukrainians penetrate as well up in Kursk and also regaining territory. It's just a killing machine at the moment. That's the problem. This is a machine designed to consume human beings. I was saying to somebody recently, I heard a Russian general talk a few months ago when he was asked by some students at a staff college, how are we going to deal with Ukraine? He simply said, we're going to throw corpses at it. And the students got up and clapped him. And it just shows you what the Russian attitude is to these things. And that seems to be the way they're doing it. And again, to be honest, if you look at the demographic imbalance, the Russians can afford to do that in a way the Ukrainians can't, because they can't afford to go on losing people at the same rate they have done in the past. So something that we discussed, I think, probably 2 years ago, we said the Ukrainians have got to concentrate on killing as many Russians as they can as early as possible, because in a long war, the Russians will prevail in that sense.
And we spoke briefly there about the level of drone production in both countries. Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies, which themselves have been embroiled in a bit of a political turmoil over recent weeks, say they've uncovered a network of bribery and price gouging in Ukraine's drone procurement. How crucial is it going to be, given the focus on drones at the moment, that Ukraine can root out those sort of issues within their production systems?
It's interesting. I mean, corruption and larceny is endemic in any government military system in wartime. You can trace it in World War II in Britain, believe it or not. Certainly you can in the United States. So this is a common feature of any sort of country that's at war, I'm afraid. Ukraine is particularly bad because of the pre-existing criminal and other corruption networks that existed before the war started. So it's incredibly difficult given the complex nature the complex character of the way in which Ukrainian society was operating for it not to be there. And of course, it's very difficult to root it out because some of these things are considered normal practice by the people involved. The key thing is that the outcomes produce more drones and more effective fighting capability for the Ukrainians. If they were to secure a victory or indeed to secure their independence from this war, then nobody's really going to worry how it's been done, to tell you the truth. And that's the key point. If something produces an outcome and your back is against the wall, it's an existential crisis. Who cares how it's done? That's incredibly cynical, but I'm afraid that is war.
Well, Rear Admiral Dr. Chris Parry, thank you very much for speaking with us today on Frontline.
Pleasure.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.